After the 2024 election, lawmakers weighed a series of election reforms, but the big one was a bill called HB300, which initially, when it was rolled out, would have essentially ended vote by mail in the state. It's been amended and changed a number of times over the process, and it received final passage toward the end of the legislative session. But where it ended up is that everyone who receives a ballot in the mail will eventually have to opt in to do so. They'll have the opportunity to opt in over the next 4 years, and universal vote by mail in Utah will essentially be rolled back in 2029. There are a series of requirements around showing ID to opt in that lawmakers did enact as part of that, but the biggest change is the end of universal vote by mail in Utah, which has been a huge part of the election system here for several years. There were a number of bills that were really attacked as encroaching on the judicial branch in the state. And a couple of those that did end up passing seemed to take aim specifically at the lawsuit that Planned Parenthood Association of Utah has filed against the state's near-total abortion ban. That law is blocked, so abortion's currently legal up to 18 weeks. But they really changed laws around when the state can appeal injunctions on its laws when people have sued over them for being potentially unconstitutional. Another bill also took aim at standing and who can file lawsuits against the state's laws. And when that came up for debate on the House floor, lawmakers specifically mentioned Planned Parenthood a number of times. There's another bill that specifically takes aim at Planned Parenthood and restricting who can provide sex education in classrooms. And it says that organizations that provide abortions cannot provide that sex ed. Planned Parenthood really has a problem with that because a big part of their purpose is to educate around consent in relationships and sexual health when it comes to avoiding infection and disease. And that bill did pass, and it's awaiting the governor's signature. A couple of years ago, Republican lawmakers rolled back the ability for transgender youth to receive gender-affirming care. This year, Republican lawmakers were weighing whether to restrict care for transgender adults too. There was one bill that would have made it so that no public funds could go toward gender-affirming care, which would mean folks on Medicaid, people who are public employees who have insurance through the government, and also people who go to the University of Utah to receive gender-affirming care could have been impacted by that bill. It didn't really end up getting a debate, didn't go anywhere, but another bill that did pass does restrict the ability of people in correctional facilities in the state who are transgender to access gender-affirming care. If someone enters a correctional facility and is already receiving hormone treatments, they can continue that, but people cannot start hormone treatment or get any sort of gender-affirming surgery while incarcerated.
HB267 essentially bans public sector unions from engaging in collective bargaining. So that means police officers, firefighters, and teachers. Since the bill was first introduced, there were protests nearly every day at the Capitol. Private and public sector unions showed up to oppose the bill. And once it finally passed and headed to Cox's desk, there was an even larger protest asking Cox to veto the bill, which he didn't end up doing. During the course of covering this bill, I spoke to a lot of union representatives who felt the bill was retaliatory against the Utah Education Association, which is the state's largest teachers union. And that is because the UEA is suing the state over its voucher program. It also sued the state over a Constitutional Amendment A and kind of won that battle, and the Constitutional Amendment was removed from ballots. Big changes coming to school vouchers this year after HB455 passed. What it does is it allocates different amounts to students depending on whether or not they're homeschooled or attend private school. So last year, which was the program's first year, everybody got a flat $8,000 scholarship. This year, homeschoolers ages 5 to 11 will get $4,000, homeschoolers aged 12 to 18 will get $6,000, and private school students will get $8,000. The bill also imposes a lot more restrictions than there were last year. So no more ski passes, no more furniture purchases. There's also a cap now on how much of a scholarship can be spent towards physical education and extracurricular activities like swimming lessons, 20% for each category of the total scholarship amount.
The initial pitch of Senate Bill 195 was to basically take a deeper look and pause some of Salt Lake City's traffic calming projects. There are lots of concerns that this bill preempts local control and basically puts the power of designing Salt Lake City streets, gives that power to the Utah Department of Transportation. The proponents of the bill want to make sure that city streets projects don't impact traffic levels on bigger streets that carry more traffic, that carry more suburban traffic into Salt Lake City. Proponents of the bill have a host of worries, mostly that this will slow down and restrict the number of traffic calming projects the city can implement. They're also worried just about preempting local control, just the fact that some state officials who may or may not live in the city now have decisions over what the city streetscape looks like. I think that's concerning for both opponents in the community as well as city leaders.
So Utah's pretty deep into a housing crisis, and a lot of that is just because we haven't been building enough homes. So around the start of the session, Governor Spencer Cox told legislators that his goal is to build and build here, and he has a goal of building 35,000 starter homes in the next 5 years. Lawmakers have proposed quite a few bills to change zoning regulations and basically just make it easier for developers to build those homes. Another bill that came out of the work of the state's Commission on Housing Affordability is likely the longest land use bill in about 20 years. It is more than 7,600 lines long. It's basically just a cleanup bill looking at streamlining regulations for zoning, making sure that definitions are consistent across the state code, and just trying to make things a little bit easier for developers to have some consistency when they're going into cities and looking to make proposals. The author of the bill said the goal is to reduce bureaucracy, help streamline the approval process, and let the free market step in and take innovative approaches to bring down housing costs. Another proposal is aimed at increasing condo construction in the state. Right now, developers are really hesitant to build condos because of some liability concerns. I talked with an architect a few months ago who said anytime that he fills out applications for insurance, he has to say whether or not he builds condos. And if he does, his insurance rates automatically go up because it's just, there are some provisions that make it easier for condo owners to sue. This bill will make it easier for developers to build condos because it would give them some reassurance. They would have about 9 months to fix any design flaws or structural concerns before someone could sue. Overall, most of the housing bills haven't really been that controversial. It's a lot of cleanup language, a lot of streamlining, and there's a lot of consensus on it because, most of the arguing happened in the interim session over the summer and came out of the work of Utah's Commission on Housing Affordability and just bringing realtors and developers and cities and counties together to reach some consensus on just changes that everybody thinks can help.
What's going on in the background right now is a protest over HB77, a bill sponsored by Representative Trevor that would ban pride flags in all public schools and all government buildings in the state of Utah. It's been passed by both chambers, the House and the Senate, and now awaits the governor's signature or veto. This is coming after two attempts last year actually, to ban pride flags in schools, and this year the effort was expanded to government buildings. This is an effort, the sponsor has said, to make sure that there are no pride flags in schools or on government buildings during Pride Fest in Salt Lake this summer. The bill also gives a list of sanctioned flags, so the U.S. flag, the Utah state flag, historic versions of those flags, as well as Olympic flags, military flags, flags from universities and colleges, and flags used for educational purposes would be allowed under the bill, and any non-sanctioned flag could not be displayed in schools or government buildings. The sponsor, Trevor Lee, has attracted a lot of controversy for this bill, not just because of his goal to ban pride flags in schools and government buildings, but because he made clear during the first House hearing about this bill that it would, in some cases, allow for teachers to display Nazi and Confederate flags in classrooms. Representative Lee denied that the bill would allow for Nazi and Confederate flags to be flown in schools, but that was the example he used for his educational carve-out in the first hearing over this bill. One of the hot-button issues this session has been immigration. HB226, sponsored by Representative Candice Perucci, aims to assist Immigrations and Customs Enforcement in deporting immigrants, both lawfully here in the country and unlawfully here in the country. The bill would increase the maximum jail time for some Class A misdemeanors from 364 days to 365 days. This 24-hour change could trigger federal deportation proceedings. The bill has been through a lot of changes and negotiations over the last few weeks, but its sponsor and its proponents, including Republican leadership in both houses, have been clear that they support the underlying goal of assisting in President Donald Trump's mission of mass deportation. A bill sponsored by Representative Katie Hall, aiming to reform some medical malpractice standards, has been a subject of controversy in the final days of this legislative session. The bill originally aimed to cap medical malpractice payouts in the state of Utah at $1 million, which is an amount that families, attorneys, patients said would be really catastrophic. The bill went through a series of negotiations, and ultimately the cap is out of the bill. It has now passed both chambers and awaits the governor's signature or veto, but it still has a major protection for doctors who are sued. It includes a provision that gives doctors personal immunity in medical malpractice cases as long as they have an insurance policy of at least $1 million. This bill has been particularly interesting because its sponsor is a nurse. Katie Hall is a nurse. Her husband is a doctor, an orthopedist. And we reported earlier this week that in 2023, her husband was sued for medical malpractice. He was dismissed from the case, but it's not something that the sponsor has talked about publicly when she has talked about her bill.
So this is the transgender dorm bill, and it was the latest attempt by the legislature to kind of hamper in on transgender rights and limit where transgender students can live. This one focuses on college dorms, and so for the public colleges and universities in the state, transgender students cannot live in a dorm that matches their gender identity. They have to live in a specifically designated gender-neutral dorm building. This bill came out of a specific situation at Utah State University. There was a transgender resident advisor who was assigned to a dorm, and when the roommate there found out about this resident advisor, she didn't feel comfortable living there. So she asked Utah State University for a new room, and she got that. But then she and her mother posted about it online, and it was picked up by some conservative circles. This bill kind of comes out of that situation and limits where transgender students can live. So the governor signed this bill into law, and it's kind of a departure for him, honestly. The first transgender bill that came across his desk was a bill that banned transgender girls from playing high school sports in Utah, and he pretty famously vetoed that. That got a lot of attention nationwide for his decision on that in his comments. But the next three bills that came his way, including the Storm bill that talked about transgender individuals, he has signed. So this is a bill that came from Senator John Johnson, who is very much into higher education. He's an emeritus professor at USU. He ran a bill last year to kind of overhaul general education, and that bill failed. He said it was a little too prescriptive, and so this year he came back to the table and is now partnering with Utah State University to do kind of a revamp of general education, and he wants the focus to be on Western civilization and the rise of Christianity, and he gave some authors a lot of American democracy focus too. So this was the big ticket item for higher education this year, was a budget cut. So the legislature took $60 million away from the budget, the base budget, HB1, for higher education, and they moved that money into this kind of separate line item. And schools can earn their share of the money back as long as they show that they're reinvesting that money in high demand programs. High demand programs defined by the legislature are things that have high wages, good job outcomes, high graduation rates, that kind of thing. So this bill actually is part of a kind of a longer trend with the legislature that we're seeing recently with scrutinizing higher higher education and the outcomes of that. Last year, they cut $20 million from the budget from higher education, and that was kind of the start of this process. In the interim, they had this audit that showed that schools were having these programs that didn't have high graduation rates, didn't have high enrollment, were essentially wasting taxpayer funds.
In December, Governor Cox, House Speaker Schultz, and Senate President Adams issued a letter to Salt Lake City Mayor Mendenhall urging her to get tough on homelessness. The letter marked another volley in the long-running tussle between the city and state leaders over how to address a rising number of unsheltered residents, heightened drug activity, and perceived safety issues on city streets. Salt Lake City Mayor Aaron Mendenhall responded in mid-January with a 27-point public safety plan that has stepped up police patrols and targeted homeless encampments and drug activity in the downtown area, along the Jordan River Trail, and in the Ballpark neighborhood. A month later, the mayor announced that Police Chief Mike Brown was stepping down at her request. She followed quickly with appointing former head of the State Department of Corrections, Brian Redd, to replace Brown. The legislature's House Majority Whip, Casey Snyder, followed up within days to introduce HB455 on Capitol Hill. The bill would require the police departments in Salt Lake City and St. George to enter into interagency agreements with the Utah Department of Public Safety, shifting some enforcement powers from those cities to the state. Among other things, HB 465 would grant state police the authority to deploy newly created response teams to city hotspots to boost public safety at the expense of cities. Other sanctions in HB 465 against cities that refuse to cooperate have been stripped from the bill, but it now includes an eminent domain clause, effectively letting state authorities seize land owned by Salt Lake City for use as a homeless shelter.
Coming into this session, we knew there was going to be a fight between the judicial branch and the legislature. The legislature was upset about some of the rulings last year, particularly around the ballot initiative question. So there were a lot of bills targeting the judiciary. They came to sort of an agreement to let some of those die. So there was a bill that would have let the legislature make recommendations on which judges be retained. That one is going to be put aside for at least a year. There was another bill that would have required judges to get a two-thirds majority in order to be retained. That one also got shelved. One that is going to make it through is a bill that would let the governor appoint the Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court. In the past, it's just been the 5 justices deciding among themselves. And then that would have to be reappointed every 4 years and stand for a Senate confirmation, which gives the senators every 4 years an opportunity to express their displeasure with the Chief Justice or put a little pressure on him or her, depending on what kind of rulings that have happened in that interceding period. There is also another bill that would have expanded the number of justices on the Supreme Court to, right now there are 5, they either wanted to go to 7 or 9. That one also is being put off at least another year. Some of the critics called that court packing, which was something that wasn't very popular when President Biden was talking about doing it at the U.S. Supreme Court level. So they're going to keep looking at that. The sponsor of that one, Representative Moss, said that Utah is a growing state and maybe needs a growing court to handle the cases, but they're going to look at that over the course of the next year. Republican lawmakers made it a priority to give Utahns another income tax break. It's a small tax cut. It's going to cut about $97 million out of the budget. That's money that otherwise would have been going to education and social services. So the $97 million that is coming out of the budget will be an average tax cut of about $35 per household for the average Utah household. There were Democrats who wanted that money to be kept in the budget to go to the schools, but the Republicans, for the 5th year in a row, decided they wanted that to go to tax cuts, which means over the last 5 years they've cut about $1.4 billion from the budget. There's another small piece in there to give tax relief to senior citizens. If they make under a certain amount of money, they won't be paying taxes on their Social Security income. And then they also are expanding the child care tax credit. So the Republicans are touting this as tax breaks for families, for seniors, and for Utahns across the board. So after last year's Supreme Court ruling that said that the legislature can't repeal ballot initiatives, there's a lot of concern that there's going to be a flood of ballot initiatives fueled by outside money. So they've really ratcheted back the ability to put ballot initiatives on the ballot. One of the things they're doing is if it would require a tax increase, if the ballot initiative would require a tax increase, it has to get 60% in order to pass. Another one is that the ballot initiatives are going to have to be published in newspapers across the state. This is the same thing the legislature has to do when it passes a constitutional amendment, but that means that it's going to cost about $1.4 million for every ballot initiative that is run between now and 2026. Now in 2026, the legislature wants to remove the publication requirement, but between now and then, anything that appears on next year's ballot will have that additional burden with it.
It's absolutely fair to say the legislature did a lot this year to assert their power, like ending collective bargaining for public unions, funding school vouchers, changing how Utahns will vote, and even threatened to make serious changes to the judiciary. Sine die, or when the legislature is constitutionally bound to end their annual 45 days of lawmaking, is midnight. And most of these bills, if signed by Governor Cox, will turn into law in early May. And then lawmakers will have the rest of the year to hear from you, their constituents, on what they should make a priority next year.